We've arrived at the river. This is where most of the players drown. Let's try to not drown. We've discussed how on the turn, your betting ratio when you're polarized needs to go from 50-50 bluffs to premium hands to now on the river, it needs to go to 67% premium hands and 33% bluffs if you're using a pot size raise and you're perfectly polarized. So understand that you do need to give up with some bluffs sometimes. A lot of people refuse to give up with their bluffs, and that leads to them just spewing off money on the river for huge bets. Don't do that. Don't be a lunatic. That said, you can maximally exploit bad players, leading to a huge amount of profit. And for example, some players will literally never call an overbet without the effect of nuts. And fun enough, say on the flop you know they raise with 2 pair or better, and on the turn you know they raise with 2 pair or better. On the river, if they'll fold everything worse than 2 pair, and the only 2 pair they could have is like top pair bad kicker that rivered 2 pair, it's not going to happen very often. In that scenario, an overbet may make them fold out like 95% of their range. So definitely look for spots where people will drastically overfold and then make them do that, because that is an easy way to win a lot of these medium to big size pots. Some players will rarely call a small bet without a strong hand. Let's say you bet half pot on the flop, half pot on the turn, you get to the river and you bet 25% pot. Some people will look at that and think, oh, you're not going to trick me. I know you have the nuts. And then they'll make big folds. That's one of my favorite bluffs that I try to not reveal too often, but every once in a while I talk about it. It's always nice to, especially when you think your opponent's range is either a really good hand or really marginal stuff like bottom pair, to make a small bet against them, because they'll very often fold, and they don't want to look like a sucker, right? They think that if you bet small and they call you and you just show them top pair bad kicker, that they feel like an idiot. And well, those are great players to bluff, especially when you cannot win. Against competent, strong players, balance and minimum defense frequency become very, very important. Not just kind of important, mandatory, because you want to make sure that you do not have any gigantic hole in your strategy. If you have some big hole in your strategy, if they're just playing well, they're going to passively exploit you. Like, they don't even have to know what you're doing wrong. But say you fold too often to river bets, all they have to do is bet at the right frequency and you're going to get crushed. Or say you call too much and they don't even know it. They just are using the right frequencies. If they do that, you're going to get crushed. Whenever we are on the river and you are betting on the flop and the turn, sometimes you will be completely polarized, but sometimes you'll have mostly marginal made hands that are good enough to bet, and other times you'll have a mix of those. So it's important to understand it's important to understand what your value betting range looks like, and if your value bets, your premium made hands, can conceivably lose to hands in your opponent's range. Now, fortunately, in small stakes games, most people don't slow play much past the turn, so if they do have like a set or better on the turn, they're just always raising, which is nice, because it means when you bet the flop and they call, and you bet the turn and they call, they have worse than 2 pair, because they would have raised all of those. So very often on the river, you can be very clearly polarized because your opponents never slow play, meaning you're just betting like 2 pair and better, and you know they have worse than 2 pair, right? So in that scenario, you are perfectly polarized. But if you're betting stuff like top pair decent kicker, and they could have top pair top kicker, well, now you need to not be betting quite so big, or you need to use multiple bet sizings on the river. If your range is perfectly polarized, you want to be using a large bet size. If your range is very linear, if you're just betting like middle pair and better, you want to be using a small sizing. And if you want to be betting with both of those two ranges, you need to be using multiple sizings. Some people think they need to only use one size on the river and just kind of blend it all together. And that's usually not ideal, because you leave money on the table with both sides of your range, right? Like, say you're value betting middle pair good kicker, and well, your opponent's only going to call a small bet with bottom pair or ace high. Betting medium doesn't do you any good because they're going to fold, right? So you often want to have multiple sizes. And to be fair, if you're playing like a perfect computer, you will have multiple bet sizings on all streets, but it's really, really, really difficult to implement very, very well. Now, of course, if you're maximally exploiting your opponent, that's a very different thing. But if we're trying to be perfectly balanced, you definitely want to have multiple sizes, especially on the river. So let's say we are on the river with a polarized range. As your range becomes more and more polarized, meaning you have just the super nuts or total garbage, you want to be using a larger bet sizing. When you do have a polarized range, bet such that your opponent will win as often as the odds they're being laid. So how in the world can you know that? Well, you want to ask yourself, on the river, let's say I have 20 combinations of nut hands and 10 combinations of bluffs. Okay? Let's just pretend we know what our range looks like, and I'll show you how to do this coming up in some examples. Say we know that's the case. We want to bet such that our opponent is getting 2-to-1 odds. Because in the long run, the way the math works out in this scenario is you end up winning the pot, whatever the pot is, if you bet with a perfectly polarized strategy, and you give your opponent break-even odds. So, in this scenario, if you have 67% nut hands and 33% bluffs, you want to bet such that your opponent's getting 2-to-1 pot odds. How do you do that? Well, you bet the size of the pot. If you bet the size of the pot here, your opponent's getting 2-to-1 odds. They need to win 33% of the time, and they are going to win exactly 33% of the time. And then any amount they call more or less than that is just going to make you money in the long run. And that is fantastic. Now, of course, if you know your opponents are going to call every single river bet, stop bluffing, right? Then you're just getting more money. So make sure, though, that you actually have a polarized strategy or polarized range when you're using this strategy, because it can get pretty bad if you're not using a polarized strategy, because then the opponent will basically they'll win sometimes when you're value betting, and that really throws off these numbers here. So when you are perfectly polarized, as we see here, if you bet the size of the pot, your opponent needs to win 33% of the time. So bet with a range containing 67% premium hands, 33% bluffs. If you bet 50% of the size of the pot, what are your opponent's odds, right? They have to put in half a bet to win a total of 2 pot-sized bets total, so they need to win 25% of the time. So you need to be betting with 75% premium hands and 25% bluffs. And if you bet 3 times the size of the pot, now they have to put in 3 to win a total of 7. They need to win 43% of the time, so your range can contain 57% premium hands and 43% bluffs. So as you see, in these scenarios, you need to understand what your range looks like. And once you understand what your range looks like, how many bluffs you actually have, that will allow you to adjust your strategy. Now, an example we recently gave in the turn section was, say it comes ace king 7 or ace king 4 7, and we're under the gun. Remember there, we don't actually have very many bluffs. We were searching kind of hard to find them. We're looking for gut shots, right? In that scenario, on the river, we may have 18 nut hands and something like, well, if we're bluffing all of the 12 we could have, it's 18 to 12. So in that scenario, we are pretty much perfectly polarized because we were betting literally top 2 pair and better. In that scenario, we can use an overbet of quite a large size. You can do the math. And that's going to be pretty strong. The problem, though, is that very often you will end up having not a whole lot of obvious bluffs, especially if you're not betting them all on the turn. So you may find yourself in a scenario where you have something like 12 nut hands and 3 bluffs. Well, there's 12 nut hands and 3 bluffs, so we can't bet very big at all. We want to give our opponent, they're going to win 20% of the time, right? Because we have 3 bluffs divided by the 15 total combinations of hands, so we have to bet quite tiny, less than 50% pot with our polarized range. So very often, if you do have a very polarized section of your range, you're going to want to find as many bluffs as you can load into that, up to about 40% bluffs. And then you can use a relatively big sizing, like 150% pot or so. Anyway, this is how the numbers break down. But we do want to talk about the problem with this, and that's that you will rarely have a perfectly polarized strategy, especially if the opponent slow plays some portion of their range on the earlier betting rounds. If the opponent slow plays even a little bit, to the point that all of your effective nut hands don't win every time, the strategy I just outlined loses a lot of value, perhaps to the point that it even loses money. Like say on ace king 7 4, if your opponent slow played aces pre-flop and ace king, well, now your ace kings are chopping. If you decide to value bet thin with like ace 4 suited, you're going to get crushed then. And that's not good. So in general, across the board, it's often wise to use fewer bluff combinations to account for the fact that many players slow play with some of their premium hands at some point. You'll find some players take this concept of trying to use that polarized strategy way too far, and they'll have stuff like top pair marginal kicker, and they'll bet it huge. And then when they bet and get called by top pair slightly better marginal kicker, they're shocked. But people can have top pair when they just check call, and that gets them in a ton of trouble. So be very careful that you fully understand what your range looks like, and don't go overboard making huge overbets unless you actually are doing the polarized range. One of my favorite spots to do is when you have the nut flush, because you actually have a lot of nut flush combinations if you think about it. And a good way to balance that is to use some of the nut flush blockers as bluffs, right? So if you have say there's 3 spades on the board, you have all of the ace-x of spades, let's call it 7 of them, and I guess it's 8 of them, is that right? Doesn't really matter. Say there's 8 of them. You could also bluff with something like, well, if you want to pot it, you can bluff with 4 ace of spades X that cannot win at showdown, and you can use a pot size bet, and then you're just going to win the pot on average. That's a nice, easy one to balance. Say you wanted to use a huge bet, 20 times the size of the pot. Well, in that scenario, you can have kind of like 52% ace of spades, X of spades for the flush, and then 48% bluffs. Obviously, though, people aren't using 20 times the size of the pot bets, but it's actually not a bad strategy if you are perfectly polarized. And studying a lot away from the table is how you learn if you actually are perfectly polarized. And like I said, we're going to get to some examples in just a minute to show you how to study this type of thing away from the table. And really, if you're a poker coaching member, you know the poker coaching homework challenges is how you do that. So now let's talk about when you are betting for thin value. Whenever you are betting for thin value, this is going to be top pair marginal kicker, maybe middle pair, stuff like that. You want to use a smaller sizing, making sure your range is protected if your opponent raises. So many players will bet only marginal hands using a small sizing, and then when they get raised, they'll just fold all of them. And that's a problem, because then all your opponents have to do is find themselves on the river with anything, like marginal made hand or bluff, wait for you to bet small, and then they know that when you use a small sizing, you have a marginal made hand, that you will still also fold to a raise. And that's really, really bad for you. So you definitely do not want to do that. So whenever you are betting in these scenarios, you need to develop a calling strategy when you do get raised. And often the calling strategy is going to revolve around you calling at the minimum defense frequency, if your opponent's good, of course. If your opponent never raises the river without the nuts, well then, obviously you fold a lot. But if they are going to raise with a balanced strategy, you should be calling with a lot of the blockers that block their nut hands, for the most part. In general, when you get raised on the river, in small and medium stakes games, and even in high stakes games, or against straightforward players in general, you need to do a lot of folding, because a lot of people will not raise the river. I mean, kind of like I said, a lot of people will bet the flop really wide, but not bet the turn really wide. Some will bet the flop and the turn, but not the river really wide. Almost no one check raises the river as a bluff all that often, unless they're really trying to maximally exploit you. If you do use a small sizing, make sure you do include some bluffs. Typically, when trying to choose your bluffs, you often want to use the bluffs that have no showdown value whatsoever, but still have blockers in your big bet size when you're polarized. You want to instead use bluffs that maybe have a tiny bit of showdown value in your small bet size. And that's because when you bet small for thin value with something like, let's say you're betting a lot of top pairs, and you also bet with maybe, let's say you think ace high can't win at the showdown, you bet ace high there. That's the spot where your opponent may hero call you with the worst ace high every once in a while. Or say even under pair, and you think the under pair obviously doesn't have blockers to the nuts, and it probably isn't going to win a showdown. That's the spot where if you bet maybe your opponent calls with ace high, that becomes relatively viable. So I understand I just told you to be bluffing with the ace of spades blocker in the previous example. That's a little bit different, though, because we're using a very big bet with the ace of spades to make it harder for the opponent to have a nut hand, the nut flush they can call. We'll go through some examples, though, and you'll see how this typically works out. But in general, you want to be if you have potential bluffing hands, let's say we have like 40 potential bluffing hands, and we know we want to use 10 of them in our big bet size and 4 of them in our small bet size. Often the ones with the most showdown value want to be bet in the small bet size, and then the ones with the best blockers need to be used in the big bet size, and then the other ones that we're giving up with, we just give up. Well, here, maybe I'm talking about this. All right, blockers are vitally important because they remove calling combinations from your opponent's range, right? Like that ace-x suited I just said. For example, here we have it. The suited ace is very important because it makes it more difficult for your opponent to have a flush. Remember the image from way earlier, how we talked about blockers way back in the beginning of this masterclass. Thanks to everyone who's still with me. But way back in the beginning of the masterclass, we showed how having the suited ace makes it to where instead of your opponent having, let's say, 20 combinations of flushes, they only have 13. That's a big deal. When you do have two bet sizes, the best ones for the small sizing have showdown value. And quite often the ones with the big size don't need showdown value at all because your opponent's never going to hero call you with like ace high when you bet 1.5 times pot. And for that reason, the blockers are the most important. Multi-way on the river, that's not going to happen very often. But again, realize the ranges will vary wildly based on how the previous action has taken place. So if someone bet the flop and the turn and then checks the river, what does that mean? Well, if they bet the flop and got called by multiple people, then they bet the turn and got called by multiple people, they either have a busted draw or they have a made hand that's pretty good and they're checking to induce you to bet with a busted draw. So in that scenario, you don't really want to do a whole lot of bluffing because if they have nothing, they're going to fold. But they likely don't have nothing, right? Because it's pretty easy for them to be checking with a decently strong made hand. If you are going to be bluffing, obviously you want to be bluffing with the bluffs that lose to their busted draws. So be aware of that. If the flop and turn check through, if it's clear that both the opponents don't like their hands, make a sizable bluff, bet 3/4 pot or something like that. Unless, of course, you think a small bluff will get more folds, because in that scenario, your opponents, especially if they are straightforward, have essentially waved the white flag and said, I give up, I'm not putting any money in this pot, maybe I'll win with my king high. And in that scenario, you want to be doing a lot of bluffing. And this doesn't necessarily just apply to multi-way. If your opponent is in a scenario where it looks like they are going to give up a decent amount of the time and you lose to all of their give-ups, don't check it down and let them win with queen high, right? You need to be bluffing in those spots. That is a great way to pick up pots that don't really belong to anyone. On the river, if there is a bet and a call, you're going to need an incredibly strong hand to call. So this is usually going to be like top pair, top kicker, or better, assuming top pair is kind of high. If the board's like 8, 7, 4, 3, 8, 8, 7, 4, 3, 9, or whatever, you're going to need more like an overpair or better to call. Obviously, the bet sizes are very relevant, right? As your opponents are betting bigger, you need an even better hand to call. Well, that's not necessarily true. If there's a big bet and a call, then you need a very good hand to call. If there's a small bet and a call, maybe you can call because you're getting better odds. Also, the betting range and the calling range may generally be weaker. But really, what it amounts to is if there's a bet and a call on a river, you need to be relatively straightforward. If somehow there's a bet and a raise on the river multi-way, you just need like the nuts, right? Remember, when people raise the river, for the most part, they just have really good hands and you really don't want to do anything to get too out of line. But in general on the river, you're going to find that it's tough to go too wrong by doing a lot of check calling against aggressive players who will just bet when you check to them. And realize what you're inducing, right? On the river, if you check and your opponent is aggressive, they're going to take a stab at it. So, don't fold. So many players will bet the flop and the turn with stuff like middle pair or better. Then on the river, they'll check, and if their opponent makes a big bet, they just fold. I have had people who come to me, like small stakes players who want to get coaching, and this is something they do. They will literally bet king jack on king 7-3. They'll bet, they'll get called. Turn will be a 9. They'll bet, they'll get called. To be fair, they maybe should be checking at some point, but they're betting. Then the river will be a random card, like a queen, whatever. They'll check the river, their opponent will bet, and then they will fold. And that is a gigantic leak because all their opponent has to do is bet and they win the pot. So make sure you don't have any egregious holes in your game. Make sure you're not a calling station, but also make sure you're not a super net. And I think you're going to find that if your opponents are generally active, they're not super nets, you need to be calling sometimes on the river. And understand, when you call the river, very often you're getting 2-1 or 3-1 or 6-1 pot odds. So you don't actually have to win all that often, right? If you're good 33% of the time, when your opponent pots it or more, you win. Well, if you're better 33% of the time or more when they pot it, you win money. So if you're good 40% of the time, you profit. And it's not actually all that hard to profit, especially if your opponents will generally attack aggression. So please don't be a nit. That's one of the worst things you can do, as long as your opponents are also getting in there and fighting rather hard. But yeah, that's the river. So we have lots and lots of full hand examples queued up. So let's get to it. Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little. I hope you're enjoying the Thanksgiving Day Marathon. I hope you're soaking up all of this great content that we've produced over at pokercoaching.com. And I want to tell you about my Black Friday sale that's taking place right now, where you can get up to 78% off many of the amazing products I've made and my coaches have made over the last few years. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the offerings that we have. We have a bunch of stuff on cash games. I have a lot of videos that I've made about cash games. I've made a pretty good living from playing cash games. And I just have these series here, as you can see, where we discuss beating loose live games, beating tough games like the tough online games, beating 5-10 no limit at Bellagio. We have things going through live at the bike hands, using live at the bike footage. And these are all great resources if you are playing cash games, so check that out. Also, I have the 29-part cash game masterclass where I teach you how to crush cash games all the way up to 5-10 no limit live and medium stakes online. This extensive course has gone a long way to helping many of my students become professional poker players. And that's what I want for you as well. Studying the fundamentals, understanding how to play your ranges, and understanding how to adjust is vitally important. And that's what I teach you here. And also how to be a pro, which includes many things besides exactly playing good poker. There's a lot of good poker players, but a lot of them wreck themselves off the felt. And I make sure my students do not do that. So, for the first time ever, I made a gigantic tournament masterclass. This thing is over 30 hours long, not even including the many hand reviews that I made to go along with this, including wins in regular tournaments, PKO tournaments, and satellites. You can actually only get the Cash Game Masterclass if you are a member of Poker Coaching Premium. And normally, we charge $99 a month for Poker Coaching Premium. But if you subscribe for a 3-year subscription, you can actually get it for less than the regular price of the Poker Coaching Standard membership. You can get 3 years for $1,399. It's a little bit less than $39 per month. And if you want to get good at poker tournaments or cash games, well, this is for you. So let me tell you about the masterclass a little bit. Like I said, over 30 hours long. There are a lot of other training sites out there that want to charge you a bunch of money up front for about 8 hours of content, no quizzes, a few pre-flop charts. That's not what we're doing at Poker Coaching Premium. Here you get access to this masterclass, and so far, literally everything else we've discussed. So in this masterclass, I teach you how to play every stage of the tournament optimally and how to maximize your equity. I go through pre-flop strategies, post-flop strategies. We compare the implementable strategy that I teach all of my students to use to the GTO solver to confirm that what I'm teaching is actually pretty close to the GTO strategy, but a million times more implementable, so you can pick the best or second best play in essentially every scenario you encounter. And if you do that, you're gonna be better than basically everyone you play against. We also discuss things like tells, mindset, finances, all of that. Everything you need to become a strong tournament player is included in this masterclass. It is big. It's a big course. It's not for everyone. If you want to, play poker 1 hour every 3 months, this is overkill. You don't need that. But if you have any desires to make significant money from poker, this is for you. However, like I said, this is not for sale. You cannot buy it anywhere. It is exclusively available only for Poker Coaching Premium members. And if you're already a Poker Coaching Premium member, you already have access to this. It's already included. Everything we've discussed so far is included. As you can see here is a brief table of contents. We discuss pre-flop strategies at various stack depths, because in tournaments you're going to be playing with various stack depths. We also discuss how to play after the flop. Every single one of these bullet points, such as when facing a bet on the flop, that includes multiple implementable strategies as well as pile solver strategies for numerous flops, numerous common scenarios you're going to be in, so that you know how to encounter, or you know how to play in many common situations that you will encounter. We also have plenty of turn strategies. Ooh, the river strategy section is very, very interesting. We discuss how to structure your range intelligently so that whenever you're betting, you're going to be difficult to play against. And when you're checking, you're going to be difficult to play against. We also, of course, discuss ICM. That's how you play when there are payout implications. We discuss all sorts of various tournament formats like progressive knockout tournaments and bounty tournaments and satellites, etc. We discuss other topics, like I said, mindset, finance, etc. And then we have a bunch of hand history reviews. As you see all of these, each of these hand history reviews is an hour or two long, where I go through all of the major hands that I played really over the last 6 months or so. All of these are pretty recent scores where I was just playing online and grinding it out. And we ended up winning a bunch of money, so that's lucky. Also, we have a poker coaching membership where you get access to loads of content. Also, we have lots and lots of classes. We have a monthly homework assignment that I go through and make sure all the students are playing well. We have a Discord channel. We have a vibrant community. All of that is there at pokercoaching.com. Regular price is $39 per month, but if you sign up for a 3-year membership, it's $299 for 3 years, which comes out to $8.30 per month. How much is that per day? Not a lot, like 30 cents per day. Hate to break it to you. If you have any desire to be good at poker, you probably need to be spending more than 30 cents per day on high-level educational content like we have at pokercoaching.com. Here's one of my students, Blaz Zerjau. You may have heard of him. He turned $5 into $1.3 million on Party Poker a few years ago. And then just recently, this last year, he turned $100 into $400,000 again on Party Poker. He says pokercoaching.com has helped him lay strong foundations to excel at no-limit hold'em games and to further work on his game with my help. He's absolutely crushing it. His results are not typical. I don't have results that good over the last few years, but he has been absolutely crushing it. And he's been a Poker Coaching member for a very long time. Like we said, you can get Poker Coaching Premium now for less than the price of Poker Coaching Standard if you sign up for 3 years. As you see, loads and loads and loads and loads of content. I didn't even mention our GTO preflop charts. We have extensive GTO preflop charts. There's an app for your phone. You can access those on your phone, and the vast majority of the material we discussed here. We also have 30-day challenges to give you little bits of content every day to ensure that you are working hard and developing good study habits. Because if you study even 30 minutes a day, every day, you're going to be really good at poker in about a year or so. So we make sure that all of our students are doing that. Like I said, you can get 3 years for only $1,399. Check it out at pokercoaching.com/Black Friday. And understand that I created Poker Coaching Premium to give you all the tools and training that you will ever need to achieve your full potential as a poker player. That is what I want for you. But if for some reason you think I have failed to deliver on that promise, I do not want or deserve your money. I am not running a training site here where I'm just trying to get your money up front and then quit poker and not teach you anything else and not provide additional content. We are consistently hiring the best players in the world to teach you how to succeed at poker. And if you think I fail at that, ask me for a refund and I will give it to you. No questions asked. You have 30 days after you sign up. If you don't like it, ask for a refund. No questions asked. You'll get your money back because, look, if I don't help you, I don't deserve it. Simple as that. I don't really know how I can be any more fair. So that's it. Hope you are enjoying this Thanksgiving Day marathon. Thank you very much for taking time to watch it. Hope you learn a little bit. Hope you learn a lot. You might as well. And again, if you want to sign up for pokercoaching.com to get access to all of this stuff that we've discussed, I know it's a lot, but if you want access to all of this stuff, go to pokercoaching.com/Black Friday. Happy Thanksgiving. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of the show.